Dead America, The Second Month, Seattle Rebuild, Part 3. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Seattle Rebuild, Day 3. Corporal Gadd strolled through the streets toward one of the main distribution warehouses in the northern part of the safe zone. The sun had been up for about 20 minutes, casting lots of shade from the low-rise buildings. The air was crisp, almost cold when the breeze kicked up, but Gadd was bundled tightly in a heavy leather jacket with extra insulation. He kept his face buried in the collar to keep his nose warm. A handful of civilians walked around the streets, a few of them headed towards the shoreline to take advantage of the waterfront before it got too crowded. As Gadd neared the warehouse, the people grew more plentiful. A few dozen workers carried in goods and removed crates from an open door. A mix of military and civilians worked together, in tandem and harmony, and it was a good sight to see. Crates piled up on pull carts that were jerry-rigged on the back of bicycles. The fuel was running low, so human power was the only way to get things moved around the city in a timely fashion. Gadd stepped out of the way as two cyclists pedaled towards him, each hauling a heavy load and nodding as they passed. When the corporal reached the warehouse, he dug around in his pocket for his ID to show the guard. "Hang on, sorry," he said. "New jacket. I can't find anything in it." "Take your time, sir," the guard drawled. "I'm not going anywhere for the next 8 hours." Gadd snorted. "I wish I had that luxury," he muttered, continuing to dig before finally finding his ID and pulling it out. "Hey, there we go." The guard had a look at it, then glanced at his face and then nodded, motioning for him to go inside. Gadd walked through the door, finally poking his nose up out of his jacket in the warmth. An oil drum sat within a large opening along the side wall, a large fire burning inside. A few people stood next to it, warming up, as others continued to mill about. Gadd unzipped his jacket, revealing his uniform underneath, and approached the group by the fire. "Morning, everybody," he said to the trio. Two civilians stood with one soldier, and the latter leaned forward to look at Gadd's name tag. "Morning, Corporal," he greeted. "You here for an inspection?" "No, I'm here on other business," Gadd replied. "Looking for Captain Matthews. Do you happen to know where he is?" "Yes, sir, I do," the soldier replied. "If you want to stay here and get warm, I'll go fetch him for you." "You are a saint amongst men, soldier," Gadd replied with a grin. The man nodded and ran off, leaving him with the two civilians. They were a younger couple, easily in their mid-20s, and wore beat-up jackets. The woman's had a tear in the arm, and the man's was stained with crimson, with rips along the bottom. They both looked exhausted, with dark circles under their eyes and gaunt expressions. "Man, I thought I looked like I needed coffee," Gadd said brightly, injecting his voice with as much upbeat friendliness as he could. Raising spirits was of great importance these days. The woman shook her head. "Been a long night, Corporal." She drew out the word, trailing off. "Gadd," he supplied. "You can call me Gadd." "We just spent 12 hours moving inventory," the man explained, "getting it ready to be distributed." The corporal nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds exhausting," he said with a sympathetic smile. "But thank you for pitching in and helping out." "It's not entirely out of the goodness of our hearts," the woman said gingerly, wrinkling her nose. Gadd cocked his head. "Why do you say that?" he asked. "There's rumors going around that if you pitch in at one of the distribution sites, you'll get moved to the front of the line when it comes to getting housing," the man replied. "Plus more food," the woman added. Gadd pressed his lips into a thin line. Baseless rumors running rampant in the safe zone could be an issue, and people getting screwed out of what they assumed had been guaranteed could cause all kinds of trouble. "That look on your face tells me it's not true," the man said dryly. Gadd hesitated, and then swallowed hard before shrugging. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you," he said, as gently as he could. "But you were lied to." The woman blinked rapidly, eyes glassy, and the man growled, his face going red. "I swear to God, I'm going to rip that asshole a new asshole when I see him," he snarled. Gadd shook his head. "I wouldn't recommend that," he said. "Oh, yeah?" the man snapped, jutting out his chin. "Well, something needs to happen to him." The corporal crossed his arms. "Who is it?" he asked. "Oh, what's his name?" the man said, and then snapped his fingers. "Private Barnes." Gadd paled. "A soldier told you that?" he asked. "Do you know where he is now?" "He was standing outside of our assigned housing," the woman replied. The corporal's gaze darkened. "And where is that?" he asked. "Small little waterfront building a few blocks west," the man replied, motioning vaguely. "Think it was one of those trendy gyms." "It's called B12, the woman added. "Big neon sign out front that doesn't light up anymore, but you can still see it." Gadd nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out a couple of food ration tickets. They were specialized and hadn't been distributed yet, but he felt like he owed it to these people since they'd been conned by someone who was supposed to be taking care of them. He tore 4 tickets free and held them out. "What are these?" the man asked, brow furrowing as he took the papers. "A peace offering," Gadd replied. "They're not good yet, but by the end of the week they're going to be worth their weight in gold. Which, given our new circumstances, would mean they're completely worthless, but you get my point." The woman smiled softly, looking over the tickets. "So, they're valuable?" Jimmy said, still not sounding convinced. "How?" "They're food rations," Gadd explained. "I'm sure you've noticed while you were busting your hump that supplies aren't exactly overflowing. We are going to be going into food rationing. Each ticket you have there is a full meal, so that's 2 each. More than fair for a night's work, wouldn't you say?" They glanced at each other and then nodded in agreement. But the woman raised a palm. "What about housing, though?" she asked. "Do you know where the football stadium is?" Gadd asked, and when they both nodded, he continued. "Okay, good. I want you to walk right over there to that table." He motioned to a table in the corner with coffee. "Get a cup of coffee to warm you up, then walk right down to the stadium and get in line for the census. That's how the housing order is made." They nodded, though their eyes were drooping. The corporal sighed. "Hang on 1 second, he said, and pulled out his communicator, turning it to a specific channel. "Noah, do you copy?" he asked. After a few moments of silence, Noah replied, "Yes, Corporal. How may I help you?" "I need a favor," Gadd said slowly. "I'm sending 2 young people to the stadium, and they need some VIP treatment." "Anything for you, sir," Noah replied smoothly. "What are their names?" The corporal turned to the couple. "Names?" he asked. "I'm Jimmy," the man replied, and motioned to the woman. "This is Kate." Gadd nodded and said into the communicator, "Jimmy and Kate, they're a lovely-looking 20-something couple in jackets that have seen better days. I was wondering if you could possibly get them to the front of the census line. There's a bit of a misunderstanding, and I'm trying to make things right." "Absolutely, sir," Noah replied. "Please tell them to meet me at gate 1A in an hour. I will be there to greet them personally." Gadd blinked in surprise. "An hour?" he asked. "You already that busy down there?" "No, sir, but it's going to take me a few minutes to procure some new jackets," he explained. "Theirs are in bad shape, are they not?" Gadd grinned. "You're the best," he said. "Please remember that if you come across some nice shoes," Noah replied. "Size 12. "It's officially on the list," the corporal promised. "They'll be there." He turned back to the couple and spread his arms. "Okay, go to the stadium, gate 1A. Just wait outside for a man named Noah. He'll take care of you." The couple smiled tiredly, appreciation in their eyes. "Thank you," Jimmy said softly. "Thank you for your hard work," the corporal replied. "Now, get going." They headed for the coffee table, leaving Gadd to warm his hands by the fire. A moment after they left, with cups in hand, Captain Matthews approached the warm area. He was an older gentleman, looking to be in his early 50s with short-cropped greying hair. He was of average height, but his shoulders were thick with muscle. "Corporal," he greeted as he stood next to Gadd. "I was informed you needed to see me." "Good morning, Captain Matthews," Gadd said, turning towards him. "I'm Corporal Gadd, working directly for General Stevens on the Safe Zone logistics." He offered his hand. Matthews shook and nodded. "Good to meet you," he said. How can I be of service? I'm here for an update, and I'm going to need to borrow a military escort for some civilians, Gadd explained, checking his watch. They're leaving the safe zone on a supply run for me. The captain turned back to the soldier who'd fetched him, and was waiting patiently by the door. Get Private Mitchell up here, he instructed. She's been itching to get out and about. Yes, sir, the soldier replied, and disappeared inside. Matthews warmed his own hands by the fire, staring into the flames. So, when are those civilians of yours getting here? He asked. Told them 7:30, so any minute now, Gadd replied. Matthews nodded. Good. That gives us time to go over what's happening here, he suggested. Before we get to that, the corporal said with a sharp intake of breath, there's an urgent situation that you need to address. The captain cocked a brow. Is that so? He asked. There's a Private Barnes who is stationed at the B-12 gym a few blocks up, Gadd explained. Apparently he's lying to the people there, telling them if they come work here that they'll get extra food and a place to live. I can't stress how important it is that we quash these lies. Matthew's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening. Corporal, I will have that boy doing East Side house clearings by the end of the hour, he said sternly, and I will make it well known why he's doing it. Thank you, Captain, Gadd replied with a nod. Now, how's the situation here? Matthews sighed and shook his head. Well, to be blunt, I hope that people like cream of mushroom soup, he said, because a lot of the good stuff has already been looted. Is our food situation worse than we thought? The corporal asked, brow furrowing. The captain shook his head. The calories are there, he said, but people are going to start getting restless with the menu, I'm afraid. Hopefully it will only be short-term, Gadd said. We have gardens being planted right now which should supplement our canned food supply. Matthews turned towards a soldier approaching with a clipboard and took the offered paperwork, glancing over it before handing it over to Gadd. This is a list of our current materials, he said. We've been focusing most of our attention to anything that can be used to fortify the safe zone. Cars, scrap metal, rebar to make the barricades more dangerous. The corporal scanned the list, nodding. He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket and began jotting a few notes. That's your copy, Matthews cut in, and Gadd paused in his notes, nodding and replacing his little book in his pocket. Before he could say anything more, motorcycle engines roared in the distance, getting closer and louder. Everyone stopped working, military and civilian alike, as 5 bikers pulled up on their choppers. They came to a stop right by the fire pit, all leather and tattoos and burly flesh as they turned off their bikes and dismounted. Guessing these are your civilians? Matthews asked dryly. Gadd grinned. That they are, Captain, he said. Slim pickings out there, huh? Matthews joked. On the contrary, soldier boy, Buck declared as he sauntered up to the fire, ponytails swishing down his back. Our good friend Corporal Gadd here needed some badass motherfuckers who could cut it outside these walls. I challenge you to find someone more qualified. Matthews looked over the group with skepticism, focusing on Meat, who towered over even most of the soldiers at over 6 feet tall, his neck as big around as Gadd's waist. Fair enough, the captain said. Few things you need to know, though. First off is that we don't have weapons to share. All 5 bikers drew blades, machetes, and knives, and all manner of shiny things, brandishing them proudly. Buck drew a silver 6-shooter that looked like it was straight out of a 70s cop movie. 44? Matthews appraised, a look of surprise on his face. Buck smirked. Just like the movie, he said. I do have a few rounds I can spare for that, the captain said. I was out of line with the slim pickings jab, and that's my way of apologizing. Buck grinned. Apology accepted, he said gruffly. I've secured you each 2 full tanks of gas that you can use however you see fit, the corporal said. Chucky raised his hand. He wasn't small, but his average height and build looked almost comical next to Meat. Pretty sure we're gonna need one of those now if we're gonna make it outside of town, he said. Sorry, but the bikes are staying here, Gadd said. Under my personal protection, Matthews added. You'll be going in by boat, the corporal explained. "We're sending you way outside the zone today." Sasha fluttered a butterfly knife around in the air playfully. "Where to?" she asked. "Little place called Cape Disappointment," Gadd replied. Rocky wrinkled his nose. "Talk about setting yourself up for failure," he muttered. The corporal handed Buck a satellite map of the area. The highlighted bay right to the ocean's edge had a town circled a few miles inland to the north, with a long peninsula running along the coast. "We'll be dropping you off at a small town called Raymond," Gadd continued. "You'll need to secure transportation, which I'm assuming someone in your group is capable of doing." Some light chuckles rippled through the crowd, and they didn't deny it. "Figured as much," the corporal said. "Once you clear that town, you're to head south to Cape Disappointment and up north to Long Beach. At the end of the day, we'll be sending a boat to pick you up. Full day of adventure ahead for you boys and girls. Hope you're ready for it." Buck nodded. "What's our target?" he asked. "There should be a couple of grocery stores in the area," Gadd replied. "Your goal is to secure 2,500 pounds of food and locate another 2,500 we can claim later." Buck clucked his tongue. "Now our deal was for 5% of what we bring back," he reminded the soldier. "But you're asking us to find the same amount that we're bringing back. We're getting 5% of that, too?" Gadd nodded. "You will be," he assured him. "You do the job we both think you're capable of, and everybody wins." The burly biker laughed. "Well, hot damn," he bellowed. "Let's get a move on, then." "Not quite yet," Matthews cut in, and as if on cue, Private Mitchell came outside. She wound her long dark hair up into a tight bun and approached her captain. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked. "Mitchell," Matthews greeted, and motioned to the bikers. "I'd like you to meet your friends for the day." The younger woman blinked at the ragtag group. She didn't look a day over 25, and the men all towered over her. "Sir?" she asked. "Corporal Gadd here has arranged for them to go on a supply run," the captain explained. "And I need you to escort them." "Oh, hell no!" Sasha barked. Buck put up a hand to quiet her and faced Matthews, hucking a thumb in his oversized belt. "Captain, with all due respect, we don't need an escort," he insisted. "Sir, we have fought tooth and nail for the entire month of this catastrophic event," Meat added, raising his chin. "Befriended others, fought with honor side by side with military and civilian alike. We have a home here, roots that we have no intention of digging up any time soon. So you can rest assured that we will return with what you ask. This young lady's talents can best be utilized elsewhere." The three soldiers stared blankly at the biker, shocked and mystified by his eloquent speech. "Damn, Meat," Gadd sputtered. "You didn't say anything like that at the bar the other night. Where did that come from?" Meat shrugged sheepishly. "These brain cells are typically the first to go once the drinks begin to flow," he said. The corporal chuckled and nodded in agreement. "I'm sorry, boys, but if you want to go on the supply run, Private Mitchell is going with you," Matthews said firmly. Buck growled. "Captain, you have my word that—" "Can I level with you?" Captains cut in, raising a hand. Buck sighed. "Sure," he said. "If it were up to me, you could go wherever you want without supervision. I could honestly care less, because as you can see, I have more than enough on my plate," Matthews said, motioning to the warehouse behind him. "And I understand the thought of Mitchell here tagging along might make you uncomfortable, and I apologize for that. But I assure you that your discomfort level doesn't come close to my desire to not get yelled at by General Stevens for letting civilians go on a military-sanctioned mission without an escort." Buck and Meat shared a look, followed by a shrug. "We understand that perfectly, sir," Meat said politely. "We're not here to trip you up. Miss Mitchell is more than welcome to join us on this mission, provided she is capable of holding her own in a fight with the enemy." Matthews smirked and glanced back at her. "Well, Private, can you hold your own against the enemy?" he asked dryly. Mitchell grinned, drawing her knife and tossing it over to Meat. He snatched it out of the air and inspected the wooden handle. It was covered in little notches and stained with lots of shades of red. "Every notch in that handle is a kill," she explained. Rocky shrugged. "Shit, girl. I've killed 3 times that many of those things," he drawled. She reached down into her boots, pulling out 2 more knives and tossing them over to Rocky. The wooden handles of those were covered in dozens more marks. "The notches aren't how many I've killed overall," she explained. "They're how many I've killed with that specific blade. And I've lost 4 knives since this thing started." Chucky clutched at his chest. "Shit," he gasped. "I think I'm in love." Rocky started laughing and tossed the blades back to her, holding up his palms in surrender. "All right, you got me, girl," he said. "But if you're that badass with those blades, I'm gonna want to see it out there." "Only if you ask me nice, old-timer," Mitchell shot back with a wink. "Old-timer?" Rocky growled. "I'm in my 40s." Mitchell shrugged sheepishly. "And pretty much anybody who couldn't run got wiped out about a month ago, which is pretty much your age and above," she drawled. "You're an old-timer by default." He scowled, but his friends burst out laughing. "Miss Mitchell," Meat declared, "I believe you're going to fit in just fine." "Please call me Ingrid," she replied, holding out her hand. He shook it, her tiny appendage disappearing inside his massive one. "Ingrid it is," he said. "There'll be plenty of time for you to chat on the boat ride," Gadd piped up. "Get over to the docks west of here. There's a small cutter there waiting for you in the harbor. There's a transport boat ready to take you over." Chucky winked at Mitchell. "You can hop on my bike, girl," he said. Sasha shoved him as she walked past. "She is way out of your league, bud," she teased. "How so?" Chucky scoffed shrilly. "Well, she's got a job that doesn't involve taking her clothes off, for one," Sasha shot back. Chucky rolled his eyes and shook his head as the blonde woman waved for the soldier to come over. "Come on, Ingrid, you can ride with me," she invited. "Us ladies have to stick together with this motley crew." "Private Mitchell?" Gadd asked. Ingrid glanced back at him just before she reached the motorcycle. "Yes, sir?" she asked. "Be safe out there," the corporal said, "and report to Captain Matthews when you return." "Yes, sir," she replied, and hopped up onto the back seat of Sasha's bike, getting comfortable. "You drop that gas off tomorrow, Gadd," Buck said as he fired up his engine. "Come on by the bar, and I'll buy you a drink." "Consider it done," the corporal said, waving as the bikers took off towards the docks. As the roars faded into the distance, the 2 men turned back to the fire, warming their hands. "You think they're up to the job?" Matthews asked. "I think they're about the only civilians crazy enough to go on a run like this," the corporal admitted. "People have been fighting just to survive for the last month, and they're not about to give up safety to go back out there. Those guys, though, I think they're excited to crack some heads again. Just hope Private Mitchell can hang." Matthews chuckled. "From what I've seen, they need to worry about hanging with her," he said. The 2 men shared a laugh and continued warming themselves, putting off the work of the day for another few moments of peace and quiet. Chapter 2. The group sat in a small enclosed area near the front of the small cutter. They bounced up and down gently as it moved across the waves. Most of the guys chatted amongst themselves, and Ingrid sat off to the side, staring out at the water. "Mind if I join you?" Sasha asked, startling her. The soldier motioned to the seat beside her. "By all means," she said. Sasha sat down, nodding as she appraised the woman, looking her up and down. Ingrid cocked a brow. "See something you like?" she asked dryly. "Very much so," Sasha replied. "I like the way you handled yourself with the boys over there. Good to have another woman around who doesn't put up with that bullshit." Ingrid chuckled. "Kind of have to do that if you're a woman in the military," she said. "At least, if you're going to make a career of it." "So you're a lifer?" Sasha asked. The soldier shrugged. "I mean, kind of a foregone conclusion with everything going on," she said, shaking her head. "But even before the troubles, I had planned on doing this as a career. My father and grandfather both served. My brother wasn't the military type, so it fell to me to carry on the family tradition." Sasha cocked a brow. "So your brother a nerd or geek or something?" she asked. "Why didn't he want to follow the family tradition?" "He was way more interested in reading about wars than fighting in them," Ingrid replied, smiling sadly. "He was studying to be a history professor when everything went to shit." Sasha hesitated. She asked tentatively, is he still around? I don't know for sure, but I doubt it, Ingrid replied softly, staring down at her lap. He was doing postgrad work at a college in Chicago. Only met a few people who started out there. The stories they tell, they're horrific. As much as I'd like to think he's holed up in the library reading up on the wars of the past, the reality is he's probably wandering around the campus as one of those things. Sasha pursed her lips. I'm sorry, she said. Ingrid shrugged. Nothing to apologize for, she said with a sad smile. I haven't met a single person who hasn't lost family and friends. Just a fact of life these days. I know, the biker replied slowly. It's still tough, though. Didn't mean to dredge all that up. The soldier shook her head. I'm glad you did, she said. Talking about him makes sure his memory lives on. Sasha smiled and reached out gingerly, patting Ingrid on the thigh, and Chucky and Rocky let out wolf whistles, prompting both women to glare at them. Yeah, there we go, Rocky bellowed. About time we got a little girl-on-girl action, Chucky added. Sasha sneered, drawing her butterfly knife. We like girl-on-girl action, too, she called. So if you keep it up, I'm going to lop your junk off and make you two perform for us. You got it? The men paled and snapped their mouths shut, prompting laughter from Meat and Buck. One way or another, you two will learn manners one of these days, Meat said. Buck shook his head. If you believe that, then I have some oceanfront property to sell you, he drawled, patting his giant friend on the shoulder. A soldier entered the room briskly. Private Mitchell, he said. Yes, she asked. We're 5 minutes out from the landing zone, he said. If you want to get your team ready and meet out on the deck, she nodded. Thank you, sailor, she replied, and he nodded and exited. All right, you heard the man. Get your shit together and let's get moving. We got a big day ahead of us. The group got up and packed their things, heading out onto the deck. The boat was about a half-mile from the shore and began to slow down as they approached the landing zone. Okay, when we stop, we have a small craft that is going to ferry you ashore, the sailor continued, pointing as he spoke. That opening there is the mouth of the Willapa Bay. Couple miles into it, and you'll find the town of Raymond. He handed Ingrid a crudely drawn map. Once there, you should be able to commandeer transportation to load up whatever goods you can, then work your way southeast until you come up the Long Beach Peninsula. You have until sundown to reach the northern tip of Ledbetter Point State Park. We will be here to pick you up. Chucky raised a hand. What if we don't make it in time? He asked. Get comfortable, then, the sailor replied dryly, because we'll make one more attempt at dawn. After that, you'll be hitchhiking back. Chucky's eyes widened. Don't look so concerned, Buck said, clapping him on the back. It'll be just like Sturgis a few years ago, when you lost your bike in that pool game. Thank you. Now I'm even more worried, the younger man muttered. Took me 3 fucking weeks to make it back home, and I still have nightmares about what happened in Montana. Ingrid cocked a brow. Dare I ask? She wrinkled her nose. Chucky tensed, but Meat leaned forward. Let's just say it involves some lady bikers, some whips, and some sexual acts that will get you put on a government list if you look them up on the internet, he explained. Ingrid shrugged. Sounds like my freshman year of college, she quipped. The others all stared at her curiously. What? She asked and shrugged again. Life's meant to be lived. Don't judge. Judge? Rocky barked a laugh. Hell, girl! If my knees weren't so bad, I'd be getting down on one of them to propose. The group laughed, and then the sailor motioned for them to approach the small craft on the side of the cutter. It's time, he said. They climbed down into the heavy-duty rubber raft, getting seated in the choppy waters as they waited. After a few moments, everyone, including the sailor, was on board. He took the controls and cast off. They were silent as they went, getting their game faces on. They knew as soon as they set foot on land they were on their own, and wouldn't be alone. The raft entered the mouth of the bay, travelling a mile or so across the quieting water. The wind was gusty and stung their faces as the small town of Raymond came into view about a mile away on the water. Even at that distance, they could see small figures moving along the waterfront. Buck motioned to the sailor.
"Park it on the north shore," he instructed. "We'll take it from here."
The sailor shook his head. "Sir, my orders are to get you to—"
"Your orders are to get us where we need to go,"
Buck cut in with a growl.
"I can see those things from here, so if we're going to get this shit done, we need to approach it our way. Now, you want to park it, or you gonna be swimming back after I throw your ass out into the water?"
The sailor shot a concerned look at Ingrid, but she nodded encouragement at him. He did as asked, pulling the boat to the north shore and getting it as close as he could without running it aground. Once they were close, the group jumped out into the shallow water, sloshing their way to shore. "I'll see you this evening," the sailor called. "Good luck." They nodded and waved as he backed up the boat and sped back towards the cutter. When they were clear of the water, they checked their gear and readied for battle.
"Let's head out,"
Buck declared. Ingrid let him take the lead, knowing she was just along for the ride. They found a road about 50 yards off of the beach and headed in the direction of Raymond. She pulled out the satellite image, running her finger along the paper.
"So, how are we looking?"
Buck drawled. "If we stay on this road, it'll take us to the northern part of town," she replied. "Just a small neighborhood, but according to the notes here, there's a small grocery store. With any luck, we'll be able to get transportation and stock up on goods before crossing the bridge into the southern portion of town."
Buck nodded. "Sounds like a plan," he agreed. "Chucky, Rocky, and Sasha will be on shopping duty. Meat, Ingrid, and I will be on cleanup. If it's moving in that store, we take it out."
"What about trucks?" Chucky asked.
"We'll get to it," Buck replied. "We need to do inventory first. No sense in boosting a fleet of trucks if we only need a couple. Make sense?"
The shorter man nodded. "Yep," he replied. The group fell into silence as they marched towards the town, and what they all hoped was a bounty of food. Chapter 3. The group stood on the road about 20 yards from the first row of houses in the neighborhood. It was a smallish area, especially when compared to Seattle. There were only about 6 blocks north to south, stretching 10 blocks east to west. Ingrid studied the map, plotting their course. "Looks like the grocery store is about 3 blocks west and 2 blocks south," she said. As they stared into the neighborhood, some movement in the front yard of a house caught her eye. There were 2 zombies lumbering about, oblivious to the presence of fresh meat.
"Chucky, Rocky, take 'em out quiet," Buck instructed softly. "Everybody else, head on a swivel."
They nodded and started walking forward, with Chucky and Rocky moving at a swifter pace, drawing their machetes as they went. The foursome moved at a brisk walk, keeping their eyes peeled for trouble. Ingrid watched as the duo rushed the zombies, both giving forceful kicks to their chests, knocking the ghouls to the ground and stabbing them through the foreheads. The 2 bikers celebrated by clinking their blades together, before wiping them clean on the zombies' clothes and casually walking back to rejoin the group. Ingrid appraised them. They hadn't been terribly graceful, but effective, that was for sure. The neighborhood was mostly quiet as they walked, with only the occasional zombie emerging from the shadows to confront them. One by one, the bikers struck them down, no ghoul posing a threat to the big group. When they reached the intersection to turn south, they looked a couple of blocks up and spotted the store.
"Well, this just got a little more complicated, I'm afraid,"
Meat said as he stared at the couple dozen zombies in the parking lot outside of the grocery store. They spilled out onto the road, but none of the milling corpses spotted them. "Not sure what you're worried about, big fella," Chucky drawled. "They ain't no match for us." Meat cocked a brow.
"You assume there are only the ones we can see," he pointed out. "There could be just as many, if not more, inside the structure."
"Well, it's not like we can just skip this one," Chucky shot back.
Meat shrugged. "Don't have any intention of skipping it," he said.
"Any of you boys like surfing?" Ingrid piped up. Rocky furrowed his brow in confusion as he regarded her.
"Won a few trophies back in my youth," he replied, "but not sure how in the hell that helps in our current predicament."
Ingrid pointed to a giant 1980s-era sedan off to the side of the road. It was one of those old cars that you could stick a family of 8 inside and still have room to stretch your legs. Rocky blinked at her.
"I'm still not following,"
he admitted. "We're a fun bunch, Ingrid. Sasha spoke up. "But some of us would lose an IQ test against those things. You might want to spell it out." "I'm thinking we get a couple of us on top of it and roll right into the mob," the soldier explained as she folded up her map and shoved it deep into her pocket. "Draw them to us and hold their attention, maybe even pick off a few. While we're doing that, the others can come up from behind and start plugging them in the back of their head. That car is big enough, so they shouldn't be able to get a hold of us."
Chucky threw up his hands. "Well, hell. If we're going to do that, why don't we just hotwire the bitch and roll it into them?" he asked. "Because the noise might attract everything else in the area," Meat pointed out as he caught on to the plan. "And it would trap whoever is driving inside. If we just push the car into the mob, if things go horribly wrong, then the people on top could jump to safety."
"Or give the others a chance to hotwire a truck and come get us," Ingrid added. "What do you say, Rocky? Want to go surfing with me?" He tapped his chin and then glanced at the house behind the car. The garage door was open, and some tools lined the walls. He strolled inside and plucked a large axe with a smooth wooden handle from the wall. He turned around and gave it a swing with a grin. "Now I do," he said. "Let's do it." Meat walked over to the driver's side door, trying the handle but finding it locked. He shifted and elbowed the glass, shattering it before reaching inside to pop the gear shift into neutral. He and Buck steered it into the middle of the road, aiming at the mob. Ingrid and Rocky clambered up on top, steadying themselves as the other 4 bikers got ready to push. Everybody was at the back, with Meat at the driver's side door to reach in to steer. "Okay, we'll get you into the mob," Buck called. "If it looks like things are going to shit, you bail. None of this hero bullshit." Rocky barked a laugh. "Shit, Buck. You ain't got to worry about that," he drawled. "Pretty sure he was talking to Ingrid," Sasha piped up. "We all know you're a pussy who will bail."
"Hey, fuck you," Rocky growled. "I don't see you exposing your ass up here."
She shrugged and winked at him, and he shook his head, turning back towards the front.
"Here we go,"
Buck said, motioning for everyone to get into position. Rocky and Ingrid got their weapons ready, he with his new axe and her with a machete, and the car began to pick up speed. By the time they were halfway down the block, they moved at close to 10 miles per hour. The breeze flowed through Ingrid's hair as they got closer to the mob, and the air grew more thick with the smell of rot as they did. A few zombies caught sight of the approaching Meals on Wheels and turned, moaning. It didn't take long for their noses to alert the others, and one by one, the zombies broke from the group, shambling towards them. "Give it a good push and get behind cover," Ingrid warned. "Don't want them locking onto you." Meat turned back and nodded at the others, and they gave one more good shove, sending the car rolling all by itself towards the store, about half a block away. As soon as they let go, the bikers tore off towards a nearby house for cover. Ingrid stood at the front of the roof and made sure her knees were nice and loose. "Brace yourself," she said. "We're about to hit him."
"I'm ready,"
Rocky replied from behind the car. The car smacked into the leading edge of a trio of ghouls with enough force to knock them over, and the car bounced up and down a bit as it rolled over them. This slowed the momentum, but the vehicle continued to coast. The sound of the impact combined with the moaning was enough to get the attention of most of the mob. Corpses turning almost in unison, dozens of them moaning as one by one they shambled towards the vehicle. "When we hit that, we're gonna come to a hard stop," Ingrid warned.
Rocky chuckled. "Not my first rodeo, girl," he quipped.
She nodded as they braced for impact. A few seconds later, they hit the mob, quickly coming to a stop. It didn't take long for ghouls to work their way around all sides of the car, reaching up towards their prey. Ingrid and Rocky got as close to the center of the roof as they could, back to back, the zombies' outstretched fingertips barely reaching their boots.
"Let's get this going,"
Rocky declared. He pulled his axe up high, bringing it down hard onto a zombie's head, splitting it in two. He jerked the blade up as the ghoul slumped to the ground and readied another shot. Ingrid dropped to one knee, using her machete like a spear and jamming the tip into zombie faces in quick succession. As a few of them dropped, she turned and noticed a particularly tall zombie over 6 feet had pushed its way to the front of the pack. It reached out from behind Rocky and grabbed his ankle.
"What the fuck?"
the biker cried, turning just in time for Ingrid to bring her blade down hard on the creature's wrist, severing its hand. Rocky growled and brought his axe down onto the top of the zombie's head, spitting at the corpse as it fell back into the mob. "You good?" Ingrid asked. He nodded jerkily. "Yeah, thanks for the assist," he replied. "Any time," she said with a grin, and they both turned their backs to each other again, continuing to pick off one monster after another. As they did their work, the other four came out of hiding, walking silently towards the distracted mob. They brandished bladed weapons spread out with spaces of about 5 yards between them. The zombies didn't know what hit them. With almost simultaneous strikes, the quartet took out zombie after zombie from behind, stabbing the backs of their skulls as they focused on the surfers. Ingrid and Rocky started yelling and banging to keep the attention on them. The slaughter continued for several minutes, swing after swing, taking out even more walking corpses. Finally, the battlefield was silent, just piles of bodies surrounding the car.
"Everybody okay?"
Buck asked. There was a round of responses in the affirmative, and Meat walked to the back of the vehicle, holding out a hand to Rocky. He helped him down, then Ingrid.
"That was a spectacular idea," he commended. "Hopefully you have more tricks up your sleeve."
She grinned. "You'd better believe it, big fella," she replied. The group turned their attention towards the grocery store, looking at the front windows busted out and the doors wide open. They stared at it, waiting for something to come out, but nothing did.
"Don't know if that's a good sign or a bad one," Buck admitted.
"I think we should do a sweep before worrying about supplies," Ingrid suggested.
"Meat, you're with me," Buck said. "Rest of you, hang tight."
Ingrid drew her flashlight and stepped up next to him. Buck cocked a brow.
"We can handle it," he said.
She smiled sweetly. "You bring a light?" she asked. Buck pursed his lips and pulled out a pocket flashlight, turning it on. Ingrid raised an eyebrow and clicked hers on, an industrial-strength bulb that lit up the area even in the daylight. Meat and Buck exchanged a smirk.
"There's a joke about my manhood in there somewhere," Buck quipped. "Come on, let's move," he said.
The trio walked up to the front doors, Ingrid flicking on the light as the two men readied their machetes. They walked inside and found a war zone. Shelves were overturned, dried blood all over shelves and the floor. A few corpses scattered about, missing various portions of their heads. To the left was a front office, and there was movement behind the glass. Ingrid and Buck approached it slowly, making sure that it was secure before peeking inside. A badly eaten body struggled to move, and once it locked eyes on them, it gurgled a moan before thrashing as much as it was able. Really, it wiggled about, permanently stuck from missing so much of its flesh.
"Could have done without seeing that," Buck quipped.
Ingrid wrinkled her nose. "Shall we put it out of its misery?" she asked.
"After we clear the place," Buck replied.
She nodded, and the three of them walked to the far end of the store, looking down the first aisle at more of the same carnage. Luckily for them, nothing was moving. They walked along the front of the store, looking down every aisle to make sure nothing else was moving. When they got to the 5th aisle, something else occurred to them.
"Buck,"
Meat said softly.
"Yeah, I know. I see it too," came the reply. "Finish the sweep, and then we can worry about it."
Ingrid shook her head as her stomach sank. The shelves were empty. She'd been so focused on looking for zombies that it took till then for her to realize. The group worked through the rest of the store, looking down every aisle and finding nothing living. Buck shoved 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a loud, piercing whistle. The others appeared at the front door, bustling inside. "All right, let's do some shopping," Chucky bellowed, and grabbed a shopping cart, turning around and then stopping short when he saw the disappointed expressions on the others' faces. "Should I grab a basket instead?" he asked. Meat just slowly shook his head. "Double check to make sure we aren't wrong," Ingrid suggested. "We're going to check out the stockroom." The newcomers nodded, though they didn't look too hopeful as they moved down the first aisle.
"I hope this wasn't the only target we had,"
Buck muttered as he led the other two towards the back of the store. "Couple more stores across the river?" Ingrid replied. He nodded.
"Well then, I won't panic yet," he quipped.
They reached the back stockroom door, pausing outside of it. It was solid and locked up tight, with no windows looking inside. Meat unlatched it and slowly turned the knob, pushing it in. Almost immediately, something was in the way, and he threw his entire weight into the door, smacking it open. A thud sounded from the other side, and moans and scrabbles as if several ghouls had fallen to the ground.
"Hold that light steady,"
Buck bellowed. Ingrid did as instructed, raising her arm up to illuminate the room. There were half a dozen ghouls in the small, blood-soaked room, and they turned towards the light from the door. Buck immediately went to work smacking zombies with his machete. Meat grabbed one by the collar and belt, lifting it off of the ground and flipping it, smacking its skull into another. The two zombie heads melded into one another as both corpses crumpled to the floor. Buck walked towards the last standing zombie, slowly shambling towards him. He took a small throwing knife from a back sheath and whipped it, penetrating the ghoul's eye and dropping it. The trio stood there for a moment, silent, listening carefully for any other movement. There was nothing. Buck walked over and retrieved his knife as they took stock of the area. There were a few large boxes that gave Ingrid hope, but the hope quickly faded when she opened one, finding it empty. Buck did the same to another and then kicked it, sending cardboard flying everywhere.
"Piss, shit, son of a bitch," he yelled.
Ingrid nodded with a sigh. "Couldn't have said it better myself," she agreed.
"Guess it's time to head across the river,"
Meat suggested. Buck growled and shook his head.
"I'm not ready to give up on this area just yet," he said firmly. "We need transportation anyway. Might as well check out the houses, might get lucky and find who's stocked up at the store. Can't imagine this place was so poorly stocked before the end."
"We don't have time to go through every house," Ingrid insisted. "You might be okay with hitchhiking back to Seattle, but I'm not."
"We checked 10,
Buck counted, holding up his fingers.
"If we're hitting pay dirt, we keep doing it. If we get nothing, we head out. Agreed?"
She sighed and nodded. It was a realistic compromise. Agreed. They walked back out to the main store, where the others were just as frustrated at finding nothing on the empty shelves. Chapter 4. Buck, Ingrid, and Chucky walked up to a house in the neighborhood a couple of blocks away from the grocery store. Sasha, Meat, and Rocky were busy in the street, cracking skulls from a few stragglers wandering about.
"Make sure you keep an eye on those things down the street,"
Buck said, pointing to a small mob of about 10 a couple of blocks away that was slowly shambling towards them. Sasha held up a victory fist. "Don't worry, baby, we got it," she called.
"If it looks like we can't handle them, we'll give you plenty of notice," Meat added.
Buck nodded and faced the house, where Chucky was peeking into the front room. "Looks like we have movement in the kitchen," he reported. Ingrid cocked her head. "Bag it or try for it?" she asked.
"The last 4 houses have been a bust," Buck said. "Maybe this thing died protecting some food."
"Let's hope so," Chucky muttered. "This shit is getting frustrating." Ingrid pulled out a knife, readying it to strike.
"You got this one?"
Buck asked. She nodded. "I'll take whatever is in the kitchen," she replied. "You just cover my 6.
"Oh, don't worry. I like covering your 6, Chucky drawled with a wink.
Ingrid pointed her knife at him. "Do you like pirates?" she asked, cold as ice.
Kinda?"
Chucky replied, blinking at her in confusion. "Good. Because if I catch you checking out my 6, she warned with a sneer, I'm going to make you look like one." He stared blankly at her before it clicked what she meant, and then he slapped an eye over his face to protect it. "Eyes up," he promised. "Good boy," Ingrid commended. Buck unlocked the door and clucked his tongue to get her attention, taking a step back. She nodded and threw the door open, strolling inside at a deliberate pace, making a beeline for the kitchen. She turned the corner and spotted 2 zombies, what had once been an elderly couple. It looked like one had turned on the other, since only the woman had bite marks. A sad common tale in the apocalypse. One of them turned just in time to meet the business end of Ingrid's blade, and she shoved it back into its companion, delaying it for a moment. She didn't waste time, stepping on the first one's chest and attacking the second with one swift jab, downing it for good. The 2 bikers made their way through the house, and a second later, Buck appeared in the kitchen.
"We're clear,"
he reported. Ingrid nodded and sheathed her knife. "Now, let's just hope there's something in the cupboards," she said, and led the charge in throwing open cabinets. A moment later, they stood in the middle of the kitchen, shaking their heads at the lack of food. Some rotted produce and a loaf of bread boasting a healthy shade of green had refuge on the counter. But that was it.
"Got something over here,"
Buck said, and dug around the back of a high shelf in the pantry. Ingrid's heart soared with hope, but then it dropped when he turned round with a single can of soup. "Is it at least good stuff?" she moaned. He turned the can around to reveal that it was cream of mushroom. She wrinkled her nose and shook her head. "So much for that," she muttered.
"Well, with our cut of the goods, can you check over there to see if there's a shot glass?" Buck joked.
Ingrid cracked a smile, much needed after the day they'd had. Chucky let out an excited whoop from the back bedroom, and the duo scrambled to get back there. They entered it to find him digging through a trunk of stuff he'd hauled up onto the bed.
"What you got?"
Buck asked. Chucky held up an old skin magazine. "Grandpa was a pervert," he exclaimed triumphantly. Ingrid rolled her eyes, shaking her head in the process. The young biker picked out a few, rolling them up and shoving them in his back pocket. "You're not seriously taking those, are you?" she asked, cocking a brow. Chucky raised his chin defiantly. "Damn right I am," he declared. "I don't know if you've noticed or not, but Seattle is a bit of a sausage fest, and given your reaction to the thought of me checking out your rear, a man's got to make do with what's available." He patted his pocket. "And in my case, it's 30-year-old porno mags."
"He's kinda got you there,"
Buck agreed, unable to hide his amusement. Ingrid grimaced. "If I hear sticky pages turning, you're walking," she snapped. "That's fair," Chucky replied. Before they could continue, a loud whistle sounded outside, and the trio rushed back through the house. Outside, the others on the street fought against a mini-mob of about 20 zombies. The ghouls were spread out pretty well, stretching over 30 yards or so. They knocked them down one at a time and slowly backpedaled.
"What's the problem, meat?" Buck barked. "You can't handle that?"
The burly biker swung a baseball bat, cracking a zombie in the side of the head and launching it clear off of its feet. In the same motion, he used the bat to point behind them, where another dozen or so ghouls headed their way.
"Oh,"
Buck replied dumbly. "Come on," Ingrid urged, and led the charge, running across the yard towards the shambling horde. They hit it from the side, Ingrid and Buck lowering their shoulders and shoving a couple of the creatures into the center of the pack, sending half a dozen zombies to the ground. With quick, forceful strikes, Ingrid went to work like a master chef with two of her knives, stabbing and slicing everything that came towards her. Despite the slices not doing anything to a zombie, the blades went through the flesh like butter and didn't hinder her fluid movements. After beating down a ghoul with his machete, Chucky paused to watch her in action for a moment, unable to take his eyes off of her taking down 4 zombies in a matter of seconds. Buck smacked him in the back of the head.
"Fight, boy," he snapped. "She catches you staring and you gonna lose an eye."
"It'd be worth it," Chucky joked. Buck shook his head, and the duo went back on the attack. With all the attention they were attracting, Meat and Rocky broke away to handle the mob lumbering towards their rear. Meat walked right up to the first zombie he spotted, what had once been a teenage girl missing her throat. He grabbed it by the shirt and chucked it into the crowd trailing behind. This gave them an opportunity to start clearing them out. Rocky sliced and diced with his blade, taking off the top of several zombie heads with ease. Meat, meanwhile, opted for the hands-on approach, slamming ghouls into the ground head first with satisfying splats. The battle dragged on for several minutes before it was quiet. Everybody looked around, making sure nothing was moving.
"Everybody good?"
Buck asked. The group nodded and murmured in the affirmative. They walked into the front yard of the last house they'd come out of to regroup.
"Find anything useful inside?"
Meat asked. Chucky shrugged. "Found a couple of porno mags, but that's about it," he drawled. "Found a lone can of soup, too," Ingrid added. Buck sighed.
"I think it's safe to say this side of the river is a bust," he said. "Ingrid, where you want to go next?"
She pulled out the map, smoothing it out before looking at the circled areas. She traced her finger along, seeing different colored circles. She glanced over at the notes on the side of the map, Okay, if we go straight across the bridge, then south a block, we'll be at the police station, Ingrid said. Couple blocks up from there are the elementary school and city hall.
Rocky leaned over. What about the grocery stores? He asked.
She shook her head. If everything up here was cleared out, there's a good chance the ones down there are as well, she explained. Small town like this, it's possible the survivors took up shelter somewhere.
And City Hall or the school would be the logical choice, Meat mused. Strong building, lots of space. If food is going to be anywhere, it's going to be there.
Buck nodded in agreement.
And if there are any guns in this town, police station is a good bet, he said. Shit, man, Rocky drawled. Probably the first time in my life I'm actually looking forward to going to a police station.
The group chuckled as they turned and started walking. Buck pointed up the street at a pickup truck.
Boys, what do you say? He asked. You want to secure us some wheels? I've had my fill of hiking today.
Chucky and Rocky took off at a jog ahead of the pack towards the truck, as the remaining four strolled through the neighborhood.
You think we're actually going to find anything?
Buck asked quietly. Ingrid shrugged. Can't do any worse than we did up here, she replied. Only person who's happy is Chucky, which just feels wrong. The others burst out laughing, and Sasha shook her head. You really are one of us, she said, putting her arm around the soldier. Chapter 5. The group sat at the north side of the bridge, looking across the river of the southern portion of the city. Buck was behind the wheel, with Ingrid in the passenger seat. Everybody else squashed into the back seats. They sat without moving because there were about 60 or 70 zombies on the bridge, most of them bunched together near the far end.
So, we're one block to the south once we get across?
Buck asked. Ingrid nodded. If we want to hit the police station, she said.
Gotta risk it for the weapons, Buck replied.
She tilted her head back and forth. Getting through this group shouldn't be a big deal, she said, but we'll have to rush to the station. He contemplated that for a few moments before looking out the window. They were beside a ransacked gas station, the pumps knocked over with very little in the store. His eyes lit up, and he smiled. You got an idea? Ingrid asked. Buck nodded sharply.
Hang tight, he said,
and put the truck in park, hopping out. He walked over to a broken window with a vintage display and grabbed a glass cola bottle from it before drawing his knife and approaching the pumps. He cut off a section of hose a few yards long and walked back to the truck.
One of you, give me part of your shirt, he instructed.
Rocky and Chucky did a quick rock-paper-scissors, the latter losing and muttering obscenities as he ripped the bottom part of his shirt off. Buck opened up the gas tank and shoved the hose in, giving it a few inhales to get the gas flowing. He filled the bottle most of the way up before yanking the hose out and tossing it aside. It took him a few seconds to assemble a Molotov cocktail, and then he held it out to Meat.
As soon as we get across the bridge, you hit the back end of them, Buck instructed. Should buy us some time to get what we need to get. Consider it done, Meat assured him.
Buck got back in and put the truck into drive, and Ingrid nodded approvingly. Resourceful, she commended with a smirk. I like it.
Buck grinned. You don't have this lifestyle for as long as I have and not pick up a few tricks of the trade, he drawled.
Molotov cocktails are a trick of the trade? She asked, cocking a brow. Now what would you need that for?
He winked. Even though my lawyer isn't here, I can still hear them saying, "Plead the fifth," in my ear, he joked.
Ingrid chuckled. Smart lawyer, she said.
Smarter client, because even though they're long dead, I'm still listening to them, he said,
and pointed at her before punching the gas. She laughed as the tires squealed, and they tore down the bridge towards the waiting mob of creatures. Buck deftly dodged the small pack of ghouls that were halfway up the bridge before moving to the left side of the road. He came to a stop, about 50 yards away from the largest group at the far end of the bridge, laying on the horn to get all of their attention. I'm assuming you have a plan here? Ingrid asked dryly. Buck nodded.
Trust me, he said.
All right, she replied, drawing out the word as she watched the zombies inch towards them. She peeked out the back window at the bikers in the back, smacking down a few stragglers that approached them. The ghouls continued to get closer, all of them packing themselves on the left side of the bridge, and it clicked with Ingrid what Buck was up to. He was bunching them together so that the Molotov was more effective. He revved the engine a couple of times, and when the zombies got within 20 yards, he yelled, "Here we go!" He punched it, turning the wheel hard to the right. They quickly sped past the zombies on the left side of the bridge, and he slammed on the brakes as someone banged on the top of the truck. Meat quickly lit the Molotov and threw it. The glass shattered right on target at the feet of a zombie a few back from the leading edge. A spectacular fireball engulfed about 15 zombies near the front. "That should slow him down," Buck drawled. Ingrid nodded. "At least long enough for us to do what we need to do," she agreed. He hit the gas and headed south, the duo looking closely for the station. After a few seconds, Ingrid finally spotted it. It was a single-story, nondescript building that could easily be mistaken for an office building if it weren't for the police sign outside. A few zombies loitered outside the entrance. Buck parked the truck about 10 yards from them, and everybody in the back hopped out. Chucky and Rocky rushed over and quickly took out the creatures, setting up a perimeter to keep an eye out. The others started going inside, pausing briefly by the door to ready themselves. Ingrid gripped one of her knives, nodding to Sasha, who opened the door. The 3 men rushed inside, Sasha closely behind, and Ingrid was immediately met with a zombie that received a quick stab to the face. There was no other movement in the entranceway of the station, which was a small reception area. A hallway led all the way to the back, and the quartet listened carefully, hearing only a faint moaning coming from that direction. "Something in the back, but sounds like they're not out in the open," Ingrid mused. "Meat, go with her," Buck instructed. "Sasha and I will check out the side rooms." Meat nodded and joined Ingrid, the two of them moving down the hallway. The doors were all shut, with panes of glass in the doors revealing offices inside. Halfway down the hall they passed a solid door with the word Armory on it, and she pointed up at it, clucking to Buck. He nodded and gave her a thumbs up, and Meat and Ingrid continued to the back. There was a door with glass in it, and beyond a couple of small holding cells. There was a lot of movement coming from them, the room illuminated by a couple of large windows near the back with bars on them. They studied the cages for a few moments, and then Meat knocked on the door. Ingrid cocked a brow at him in confusion. "If those cells are open, that would get them to come out," he explained. Ingrid nodded, and the duo watched for nearly a solid minute. They watched ghouls thrashing about, shoving their arms through the bars, but none of them escaping. "Let's check it out," Ingrid suggested. They cautiously opened the door, preparing to leap out at a moment's notice if trouble came up. They were relieved to see that both cells were locked up tight. "It smells like concentrated ass in here," Ingrid muttered, wrinkling her nose at the pungent smell as the zombies moaned intensely at them. The duo carefully looked over the trapped ghouls. They had numerous bite marks on them, with others on the ground, lacking muscles and flesh to be able to stand, as if they had been at the buffet. Ingrid looked to her right, spotting the decaying corpse of a police officer sitting on the floor. She motioned to Meat, and they investigated. He held a handgun in his limp hand, a hole in the side of his head. She noticed a piece of paper gripped tightly in his other hand, and she grabbed it. "What does it say?" Meat asked. She smoothed it out and shook her head. "Forgive me," she read, and then crumpled it up, tossing it aside with a shake of her head. "What do you think it means?" Meat grabbed the handgun and ammunition from the officer's belt. "Look at the wounds on those creatures," he said. "If I had to guess, they locked up the sick before they turned. When the first one died, it turned the cells into a feeding frenzy. I assume it was more than this man could bear to live with." Ingrid shook her head. "Has to be a rough way to go," she agreed. Cursing erupted in the hallway, and the duo rushed back out. They reached the open armory door, where Buck and Sasha emerged angrily. "Guessing it's not good news?" Ingrid asked. "Fucking hell, no it ain't," Buck cried, fists clenched. "It's empty," Sasha confirmed. "This is not turning out to be the most productive outing." "Don't give up yet," Ingrid said with a forced smile. "We still have places to check." Buck looked at his watch. "This is taking longer than expected," he muttered. "We're going to have to speed it up." "There are plenty of us," Meat piped up. "Perhaps we should split up." "One group checks City Hall, the other the school," Ingrid suggested. Cursory check. If there's significant resistance, we regroup and attack it as one unit? Buck nodded.
Fuck it. Let's do it.
The group walked out of the police station, leaving the moaning mass of rotting flesh to live out an eternity in a cage until complete decomposition. Chapter 6. Ingrid, Chucky, and Rocky walked down the street towards the school, the truck parked in between it and City Hall. As they started to walk, she looked back to the others. 20 minutes, and we're back here, she said firmly. Buck nodded. Be safe, he said. The three of them walked, keeping an eye out for trouble. There were signs of conflict on the town streets, such as broken windows, long-dried bloodstains, some corpses here or there, but for the most part it didn't look too major.
I swear it looks like the whole town just picked up and left, Rocky said.
Chucky cocked his head. You're assuming anybody in the town survived this, he said.
Don't see why they wouldn't, Rocky replied with a shrug. We're in the middle of nowhere. They had time to plan for the coming trouble.
Did they, though? Ingrid asked. Rocky blinked at her in confusion.
He said slowly. Yeah? I just said they did.
Yeah, you did. But that doesn't make it true, she countered. We're only an hour or so from Olympia. Given the housing prices, it's perfectly safe to assume that someone here worked up there. They came into contact with one person from the airport, and the town may have only had a few hours' notice before things went south. Chucky nodded as he caught on. Couple people go crazy in the middle of the night, realize what's going on, and next thing you know, it's a full-blown grade-A shit show, he drawled. 2 ghouls came around the side of a building, covered in bite marks. Ingrid spoke as she broke away from the group to take care of them. Explains why they had sick people locked up in the jail there, she said, delivering a quick strike to the side of a zombie's head. Also explains why that officer felt so guilty, she continued, stabbing the second one in the eye without breaking a sweat. Just the chaos of the moment, being ordered to lock up your friends and neighbors only to watch them rip each other apart, knowing you can't do anything about it? She rejoined the group, though her eyes were far away as she trailed off.
You all right?
Rocky asked, brow furrowing. She took in a sharp breath, still not looking at either of them. You ain't got to talk to us, but just know you can, Chucky said, surprisingly gentle considering all the lewd stuff that had come out of his mouth. We had an old-timer in the gang, Jethro, spent a few years of his youth in the jungles of Vietnam. He'd get that same look on his face when he'd remember something he didn't really want to. Ingrid nodded, lowering her gaze. I know Rocky and I here aren't the most touchy-feely dudes in the world, Chucky continued, but we take that shit seriously. PTSD is no joke. She took another moment and then nodded. I appreciate the sentiment, she said quietly, but didn't elaborate. The other 2 nodded, dropping the issue as they reached the school. All the windows were either boarded up or metal shutters closed across them. They walked up to the front doors, pulling on them to hear chains clinking on the other side.
Well, at least we know whatever is in there is locked up tight, Rocky said.
Ingrid shook her head. Yeah, but so is whoever locked these doors in the first place, she pointed out. What are the odds it's just one dude? Chucky joked.
Rocky snorted. About the same odds as Ingrid here wanting to run off to a tropical island with me, he drawled.
Shit, Chucky quipped. Hell, that doesn't actually sound too bad, Ingrid said with a twinkle in her eye.
Wait, really?
Rocky asked, eyebrows raised. She smirked. Yeah, I mean, I can always push you overboard once we find the island, she said. Chucky broke out into cackles, smacking his buddy on the arm. Rocky joined in, shaking his head as they followed Ingrid around the building. Come on, let's check those boarded-up windows, she said. Maybe we'll get lucky. They checked the classrooms, finding one that only had a few boards over the window. They looked inside, shining flashlights, finding only a vacant classroom with the door closed. Chucky and Rocky worked to pull out the boards, which was surprisingly easy. The latter began to work on unlocking the window, but Chucky shoved him out of the way and smashed it open with a rock. All right, boys, give me a boost, Ingrid said, sheathing her knife. They crouched, lacing their fingers together to give her a step up through the window. As soon as she landed, she made a beeline to the door, checking to make sure it was secure. There was a tiny sliver of a window on it, giving her a minuscule view of the darkened hallway. She let her eyes adjust to get a better view, finally seeing nothing moving. Rocky and Chucky clambered inside, grunting, and crept up beside her.
"See anything?"
Rocky whispered. She shook her head. "All quiet," she replied. "But I can't see too far down the hall."
"So, where are we going?"
Chucky asked. "Only about 10 classrooms in this building," she replied softly. "Let's just make sure those doors are locked and head to the lunchroom. Just make sure you leave this door open so we can make a quick escape if we need to." They nodded as she opened the door, the three of them inching out into the hallway. It was dark, however beams of stray light pierced through the classroom doors, as well as through a few sporadically placed skylights in the hallway. There were no signs of struggle, just a normal hallway, and they peeked into the rooms as they went, at first seeing nothing, but stopping at the next door.
"Yikes,"
Chucky muttered. They looked through the sliver of window and saw the classroom was packed tight with creatures. They milled about, bumping into each other like bumper cars at a carnival. One of the ghouls noticed them and lumbered over to the door, smacking its face against the glass, gnashing and drooling black blood across it. It slammed its hands against the door, echoing lightly throughout the hallway. "Come on, let's get moving," Ingrid said. She led the group towards the lunchroom at the end of the hall, but stopped about 20 yards short.
"What is it?"
Rocky hissed. She pointed to a door on the left that was ajar, a pair of legs sticking out that prevented it from closing all the way. The sound of the creature on the door behind them banging continued to grow, and a moment later, the door began to creep open. "Get to that door!" she shrieked, and took off sprinting with the two guys close behind. She lowered her shoulder and slammed into the opening door, meeting stiff resistance. An arm reached out from it, flailing wildly. A few seconds later, and a couple more arms sprang forth. Rocky and Chucky joined her at the door, pushing as hard as they could against it. Their combined weight and force was enough to stop the door from opening further.
"What the fuck are we going to do?"
Rocky cried. Ingrid looked back and forth. "Can you guys hold this door shut for a minute?" she asked.
"Yeah?
But what are you going to do?" Chucky replied. "I'm going to check the lunchroom," she explained. "If there's food, we can come back. If not, we can run like hell and forget this place." Rocky nodded.
"Go. We got this," he cried.
Ingrid broke away from the door, sprinting towards the lunchroom with a knife firmly in hand. She paused at the set of double doors, gently opening them up, prepared to deal with whatever is inside. Much to her relief, it was empty. The tables and chairs were set up like it was a normal school day, but there were no signs of movement or any evidence anybody had been inside for quite some time. "Maybe," she muttered to herself, "maybe." She hopped up on one of the tables and ran the length of the room, not wanting to risk there being a downed zombie hidden in the shadows underneath the table. She reached the end and jumped down, heading into the kitchen area. The sun shone through skylights, showing an industrial-style kitchen. So many shiny cooking stations, but nothing to go inside of them. No boxes of food, no cans on the shelves, nothing. "Fuck me," she muttered, looking around. She finally spotted a door that she hoped led to a pantry. She went over and threw it open, only to find it had been ransacked. There were a couple of empty cardboard boxes on the floor with chicken soup printed on the sides. She kicked the cardboard in frustration. "Where the hell did all the food in this town go?" she snarled to herself, letting out a huff of frustration before turning and running back out of the lunchroom, on the tables again for safety. As she ran back towards the two bikers holding the door, one of the zombies managed to push its way out, falling to the ground in the process. As it struggled to get up, Ingrid rushed up and slammed her blade through the back of its skull. "There's nothing here," she snapped. "Let's get the hell out of here." She took a few steps away from the door as the two men coordinated their escape.
"On 3, Rocky said. 1, 2, 3.
They both leapt back simultaneously, and the mass of zombies inside slammed the door into the wall so hard that it cracked the glass. The trio backed up quickly about 10 yards, watching a huge mass of rotting flesh pouring out of the room. Dozens of ghouls invaded the hallway, falling all over themselves to shamble towards them. "I'm starting to think nobody had a chance in this town," Chucky mused as they rushed into the classroom they'd entered from and secured the door. Well, at least one person did, because I don't think these things are hiding the food from us, Ingrid replied as she locked out the lumbering mass. Come on, let's get out of here. Hopefully the others had better luck at City Hall. Chapter 7. Buck, Meat, and Sasha walked up the road to City Hall, and within 50 yards it was clear something bad had gone down there. Jesus H. Christ, Sasha breathed. What the hell happened here? There were makeshift barricades by the front door of the 2-story building that had been completely destroyed. Bodies littered the street and sidewalk. Heads were missing, bloodstains everywhere. Just a general sense of chaos and carnage.
It would appear as though someone made this place their last stand, Meat mused. It would also appear as though it did not go well for them.
The group stepped over corpses, some of which had bite marks, others that were free of any wounds outside of the headshots that put them down for good. As they worked their way up to the building, Sasha nearly slipped on bullet casings on the ground, only to be caught by the boys. Thanks, she murmured.
At least we know where all the bullets in this town went, Buck quipped.
Meat pointed up at the wall of City Hall, plastered with handwritten notes.
What's that?
He asked. The trio worked their way towards it, stopping to check the front door of the building, which was tightly secured from the inside.
Locked,
Buck muttered. They peeked inside, seeing dozens of lumbering figures that slowly shambled their way to the sounds of the rattling doors. The group let out a collective sigh and kept moving towards the wall Meat had pointed out. They let out an audible gasp when they realized what it was. Photos and handwritten notes like a wall of the missing from other calamities and natural disasters that had hit the world throughout time. Many of the photos of people had the word missing written in marker beneath them. There were also a lot of big notes, and as they read some of them they realized they were similar in message. People explaining to their loved ones how they were going to try and reach Vancouver Island.
Looks like everyone was trying to get to the same place, Buck murmured.
Yeah, but why in the hell would they try to go to Vancouver? Sasha asked, shaking her head and stepping back from the wall. It's as big of a mess as Seattle, if not more so, since Canada isn't exactly known for having an armed population.
Meat shook his head. It's not Vancouver proper, he explained. There's a rather large island just to the west of the city. Thanks to conservation efforts, it's mostly wilderness. There are a few small towns scattered about on the eastern shore, but for the most part it's empty. You know, get the right group of people up there and that could be a sustainable situation, Buck said. At least in the short term.
Sasha cocked a brow. Right group of people? She asked.
Hunters and fishermen, Meat explained. Lots of wildlife up there, so plenty of things to keep a small group fed. The trick is keeping it a small group, however.
She looked around with a shrug. This town looks like it's small enough, she said. Plus, with the number of those things we've encountered, I can't imagine too many of them made it out alive.
That's true, Buck said. But how many small towns like this up and down the coast had the same idea? Could get real ugly real quick.
Meat shook his head.
It's not our problem, however, he said. What is our problem is that we have not been able to find anything of value at all. Forget us being able to have a feast. This is becoming concerning for everyone in Seattle.
Buck clapped his hand on the big man's shoulder.
Don't worry, big fella, he said. We can't be the only group they sent out looking for stuff. Maybe we're just the unlucky group this trip.
I hope you're right, Meat replied.
Come on, let's get back to the truck,
Buck said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder.
Maybe Ingrid's group had better luck.
They walked back towards the vehicle, looking down at the group as they went, taking stock of the carnage that had taken place. Even though they had to put it out of their heads and focus on the mission, it was difficult not to feel sorrowful for the state of the world. When they approached the truck, the other three sat in the back, lounging about like it was a lazy Sunday afternoon.
Well, I don't see boxes of food, Buck drawled. So is it safe to assume you struck out as well?
Chucky shrugged. Found a shitload of zombies, does that count? He asked.
Buck shook his head. Not unless they had backpacks of food, he quipped.
Can't say that they did, Chucky replied with a sigh. What about you guys? Ingrid asked, though her voice wasn't hopeful. Anything? Buck and Sasha shook their heads as Meat held out a note he'd pulled from the board. Ingrid read it and nodded thoughtfully. Well, that's something at least, she murmured.
What is it?
Rocky asked, leaning in. She handed the note over, and the two bikers leaned in to read it together. Potential survivors, Ingrid said. Could explain why this town has been picked clean. Chucky shook his head. Okay, but how does that help us? He asked. Or does it help us? I can report it to the higher-ups, Ingrid explained. We might be able to get those survivors into the fold in Seattle, or at the very least trade with them for some wildlife. Meat furrowed his brow.
Or the military will do what they always do to smaller groups, he said dryly. Overwhelm them and take whatever they want.
Hey now, Ingrid barked, but then paused to think about it, begrudgingly nodding in agreement. Yeah, you're right, she admitted. Still not polite to point that out.
Apologies,
Meat said, raising his palms in surrender.
I meant no offense.
Sasha crossed her arms. So, you going to tell them? She asked. Ingrid contemplated for a moment before folding the paper up and putting it in her pocket. Vancouver Island is too close to Seattle, she explained. Sooner or later, a scout is going to head up there to investigate. They need to know what they're walking into. Last thing we need is a misunderstanding and a war to break out. The group looked around at each other, nodding in agreement, even if it was begrudging. So, where does that leave us? Chucky asked. She pulled out her map and traced her finger along a highway that ran to the southwest, then up a peninsula on the western edge. We should start heading for the rendezvous point, she said. There are a couple of small towns along the path. Maybe we'll have more luck finding stuff there?
Can't be any worse than what we have here,
Buck said with a shrug. He and Ingrid hopped into the cab of the truck, while the others piled into the back. He started it up and slowly headed out, not jerking his passengers around too much. The group looked back towards City Hall at the carnage, as well as a few zombies lumbering from the other side of town. There wasn't anything to be said, just a creeping sense of dread that slowly washed over them, the ebb and flow of the tide of the apocalypse. Chapter 8. The group drove on a lonely stretch of highway to the southwest. All along the banks of the water were trucks and other vehicles backed up to the water's edge. A couple of capsized boats littered the ground like they'd been rushing to get into the water, and didn't quite make it. As they drove slowly by, Rocky pointed at blood splatters across the capsized boats and the ground next to them.
Whoever's boat that is looks like they had a bad day, he said.
Meat shook his head.
Even the people who managed to get into the water had a bad day too, he said. It's never a good thing when the best possible outcome is living outdoors on an island in the middle of winter.
I don't know, that sounds kind of badass if you ask me, Chucky said with awe. Like the rugged men of old, setting off across the frontier in search of a better life. Just you versus nature. And for the 10% of people who managed to make it through that in one piece, I'm sure it was, Sasha quipped. I get the sense you'd end up like the other 90%. Chucky cocked his head. Oh yeah? And what's that? He asked.
Either frozen solid, mauled by wildlife, or a member of the Donner Party,
Rocky said, counting off on his fingers. Laughter rippled through the group as they continued their ride along the highway. They marveled at the number of vehicles lining the road, easily in the dozens. If there was a boat in town, it ended up here, it looks like, Chucky mused. Sasha nodded thoughtfully. Looking at the number of trucks here, it kind of gives you hope that a decent number of people made it out okay, she said.
Every person who made it out of this town alive lessened the chance for the group's survival, Meat said solemnly.
The group sat in a stunned silence for a moment as they processed his words. Well, goddamn there, Meat, Rocky drawled finally. You want to bring us down a little bit more? The beastly man shrugged.
No sense in sugarcoating things, he said. Every person that escaped is a mouth to feed with dwindling resources, and since this exodus most likely happened at the start of this madness, every person escaping increased the risk of infection, either by hiding the fact that they had the wrong blood type or concealing a bite.
Or not even knowing that the bites were contagious until it was too late, Sasha added. Remember Charlie? Poor bastard lost a pinky finger and thought he was okay. 2 days later, and he was chasing us around the bar like a crazy person. Meat nodded thoughtfully. That is true, he agreed. Ignorance was in abundance back in those days. Hopefully there was someone smart enough to quarantine the group on the boats once they reached the island. That way, if someone turned, the damage was minimal. And if they didn't? Chucky asked hoarsely. Then we just might look out and find a stockpile of food and supplies unguarded by a small handful of undead, Meat said. Hope bloomed, immediately smacked down with the implication of what that meant. The idea that anyone who escaped the current hell had most likely just momentarily postponed the inevitable. As they contemplated their dark fate, the truck slowed to a stop. Yo, Buck, everything okay up there? Chucky asked through the window. Just thought you knuckleheads would appreciate where we just pulled up to, Buck called back. The group stood up, looking out over the roof. You gotta be fucking kidding me, Rocky growled at the large sign welcoming them to Cape Disappointment State Park. Well, at least they know what kind of day we're having, Meat quipped. And the view is nice, Sasha added. The group looked past the sign at a nice beach area with small waves gently crashing against the sand. They took a moment to enjoy the view before Buck got them back on task. All right, get comfy. We got a mile or so to go before hitting Seaview, Buck said. Chucky sat down with a huff. You really think we're going to find anything? He asked. It's the biggest community on the peninsula, Ingrid replied. So if we're going to find anything, it's going to be there. Fuck it, Chucky quipped. Not like we have anything else to do today. Sasha clucked her tongue. Speak for yourself, she huffed. I wouldn't mind hitting the beach for a bit. It's not that cold when the sun is hitting you. Well, if we don't make it to the pickup point, you're going to get your wish, Buck said. Only there isn't going to be any sun, and it's going to be cold as balls. Sasha nodded and sat back with the others. Buck hit the gas, and they took off towards Seaview. They drove past a handful of beach houses dotting the landscape on both sides of the road. There were only a small handful of zombies moving in the distance, easily 100 yards away, moving slower than normal over the sandy landscape. They drove for a minute before stopping short of a small downtown area. A few dozen ghouls shambled around in the road ahead, and Buck and Ingrid watched the situation carefully. Doesn't look like too many of them, Buck said. Ingrid shook her head. Look at the side roads, she instructed. He did so, finding several ghouls emerging from behind the buildings on either side of the main road. Shit, he said. Chucky knocked on the window. What are we waiting on? He barked. Let's cut these suckers down to size and get on with it. Just making sure we're doing it safe, Buck replied. When the hell have we ever done that? Chucky quipped. First time for everything, Buck replied. Meat poked Chucky in the ribs and pointed. Look at the side streets, he instructed. What? The younger man asked. Look, Meat insisted. Chucky, finally realizing what the others were seeing. Ah, shit, he muttered. Until we know what we're dealing with, it would not be wise to run headlong into battle, Meat explained. Chucky waved him off. Yeah, he groaned. Ingrid got out of the truck, drawing a knife in each hand. Where the hell you going, girl? Sasha cried. Getting stock of the situation, Ingrid replied. You hang tight. I'll be back in 5 minutes. While I'm gone, see if you can find another way around. Buck nodded. You got it, he said. Ingrid ran towards a row of houses with sandy dunes on the other side, instead of a side street. She looked up towards the town at a row of stores about a quarter-mile up, with nothing but sand between her and them. She moved as quickly as she could, but it was slower on sand than on pavement. As she jogged, she glanced over away from the road at the water and the ghouls stumbling about, unable to make it up the steep dune leading up. That's right, stay down there, she huffed as she ran, and finally reached the row of stores. While it was the back of the building, there was a small driveway for deliveries. At least there were no zombies on that side of things. She moved up a couple of structures, finding one of the back doors hanging open ever so slightly. She cautiously walked up to it, peeking inside. It was a small diner with a decently sized kitchen separated from the main dining room. She looked carefully, making sure nothing was moving in the kitchen, and then stepped inside once she was satisfied. When she reached the food window, where the servers would pick up the orders, she looked through it towards the street. Past a giant wall of glass at the front of the building, she could see a couple dozen zombies hanging around. "Well, that's not going to work," she murmured to herself. She looked around inside the restaurant, finding only a lone zombie pressed up against one of the windows, trying to get outside. Another ghoul bumped up against the front door, and it thunked, thankfully locked. "Let's get a better look," she thought, and moved through the kitchen door. She snuck up behind the zombie by the window and took it out silently with a blade to the skull, without it even realizing she was there. Ingrid looked both ways up and down the street at a significant amount of ghouls. It was easily 100 or 150 based on her estimation. "Damn," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. The stores along the street were nothing but trendy tourist traps. No places that might have food, or at least food outside of chips and chocolate bars. She finally spotted something resembling a food store at the far end of the block, the furthest point from the zombie mob. "All right, we're in business," she thought, and retreated out the back. She raced back towards the group with a bit of pep in her step, and Rocky cocked a brow as she approached.
"Looks like you found something," he asked hopefully.
Ingrid shook her head. "Found a potential," she corrected, "and it looks like we can reach it without a tremendous amount of trouble." "Exactly how much trouble are we talking about?" Chucky asked. She pursed her lips. "On a scale of 1 to 10? "Sure," he agreed. She tilted her head back and forth. "A solid 5, she said, then added, "for most of us." He let out a deep, defeated sigh. "And for me," he muttered. 7, she said with a grin. He chuckled and shrugged. "Oh, is that all? I can handle that," he assured her. "What do you need me to do?" "We need to pull those things away from the far end of town," Ingrid said. "So I need you to get on the other side and make as much noise as you can to pull them that way." He blinked at her, lips pursed, a clear look that asked, "Bitch, are you for real?" "Yes, I am for real," she replied. He gaped in shock. "Wait, how'd you do that?" he asked. "Know what you're thinking?" she asked with a shrug. "It's not that hard. Now, can you do it?" "Yeah, I can," Chucky retorted. "Once I pull them out of town, then what the hell can I do?" Ingrid motioned to the water. "Get them to the beach and head north," she instructed. "We'll pick you up about half a mile up on the main road." "Give me 5 minutes and I'll be in position," he said. Ingrid nodded. "Rest of you come on," she said loudly. "I have the perfect staging area." Chapter 9. Chucky got into position at the western edge of town, about 100 yards away from the road. He ducked down behind a dune, with the water behind him, as well as some beach houses and a hotel about a quarter-mile away. "Why do I always get assigned this bullshit?" he muttered. "How the hell did I become the low man on the totem pole?" As he chewed over this, he realized that several of the newcomers to the biker gang had died over the last month. He shook his head. "We really need to recruit some new blood." He looked at his watch, seeing it was time to act. He pulled himself up on top of the dune, looking at the zombies in the distance. The sight of so many in one place, all prepared to head his way, was daunting to say the least. He steadied himself and caught his breath before letting out a loud whistle, gaining the attention of a handful of ghouls. He waved his arms maniacally. "Yeah, come get some, assholes!" he screamed. Moans started up, and like a chain reaction the attention of the zombies spread quickly down the line. The chorus of the undead was quickly deafening, all of them shuffling towards him. Chucky stared at the sight, marveling at his ability to do that in a single whistle. "Oh, this was a bad idea," he groaned, but stood firm as they began to work their way off of the road and into the sand. At least the sand slowed their movement some, so he had the speed advantage. As Chucky quivered on the beach, the rest of the group was in the restaurant, hanging out in the kitchen. They looked out the food pickup counter towards the front windows. A few of the zombies started shuffling off towards their companion, moans alerting the rest of the ghouls and sending them on their way. "What do you know? Chucky is actually doing his job," Sasha drawled.
"First time for everything," Rocky quipped.
Buck turned to Ingrid.
"How long shall we wait to move?" he asked.
She held up a single finger to get him to wait a moment, and snuck into the main dining room, staying low and against the wall to avoid detection. When she reached the window, she looked to the right towards the store, seeing only a couple of zombies who were uninterested in what the mob was doing. To the left, the back end of the horde was about half a block down, and she nodded before creeping back to the others. 2 more minutes should do it, she said softly. We'll have a few to dispatch, but won't be any big deal.
Buck nodded. "Then we get in, see what we're dealing with, then head back to the truck," he said.
"If things go well, you run back to get it while the rest of us prep the goods," Ingrid instructed.
Meat nodded. "I'm sure that Chucky will appreciate that," he said.
The group got ready to move, readying melee weapons and staging by the door. Ingrid looked down to the left at the back of the mob, a block and a half down. "Okay, let's do it," she said, and opened the door quietly. The group carefully left the restaurant, rushing towards the grocery store. Buck and Meat ran over to the trio of zombies milling about, delivering quick strikes to put them down for good. Ingrid got to the door and peered through the glass inside, but there was no movement that she could see. She tried the door, but it didn't open. She put her knife blade tip in the corner of the glass and gave the hilt a solid smack. The glass shattered, littering the ground, but thankfully it wasn't loud enough to attract the attention of the mob a couple of blocks away. "We're in," she hissed, and reached inside to unlock the door. The group all rushed inside and secured the door quickly.
"Fan out, see what you can find," Buck instructed.
They all worked their way through the handful of aisles, seeing nothing of value on the shelves. There were dry goods like paper towels and garbage bags, but no edible food of any kind. "Damn it, all I have are rotted vegetables," Sasha called.
Rocky snickered. "Not like you'd eat them if they were fresh," he shot back.
"Yeah, fair point," Sasha agreed.
"Anybody got anything?"
Buck piped up from his area. There was no response, and then he added,
"Nobody?"
There was a chorus in the negative, and he growled under his breath.
"God damn it," he muttered.
"We should get back to the truck and get to the rendezvous," Ingrid said as she joined him in his aisle. The group walked back towards the front of the store, and then a gunshot sounded in the distance.
"What the fuck is that boy doing?" Rocky asked. "Didn't even think he had a gun."
"I don't think he does," Meat said. They listened carefully and heard another shot, then several going off at almost the same, at a different caliber to each other.
"What in the hell is that?"
Rocky demanded. "Other survivors," Ingrid said, her heart racing.
"Christ," Buck blurted.
"Let's just hope they're friendly," Meat said. Rocky threw up his hands. "Oh yeah, they sound real friendly," he drawled. "We just pulled a couple hundred zombies in their direction," Meat said. "I'd be shooting too." "So what the hell do we do?" Sasha demanded. "We help them, that's what," Ingrid said firmly. Buck nodded. "You call it," he said, motioning to her. "Buck, you and Sasha get back to the truck and get it up to the beach, and start making some noise," she instructed. "Give them another target to come after. The rest of us are going to head out the back and go towards them. With any luck, we should be able to start picking some of the ones at the back off and get them on multiple fronts. Let's move." Buck and Sasha nodded and took off running back towards the truck, while Ingrid led Meat and Rocky to the back of the store. She opened the back door carefully to make sure nothing was near them. They hit the asphalt in the back and started running. The gunfire in the distance intensified, several shots popping off every few seconds. When they reached the end of the road, they gaped at the battle that was unfolding. There were about 100 zombies surrounding a small 2-story hotel, with 3 people firing from the second floor.
"Christ,"
Rocky breathed.
"How do you want to handle it?"
Meat asked, cocking his head to Ingrid. She surveyed the battlefield, seeing a stream of zombies coming from their left from the main road and over the sand. There was a path between the dunes that led to the hotel, and it was packed with ghouls. She looked over to the right, about 40 yards away from the hotel, where a 10-foot-tall dune stood with a steep incline. "To that dune!" she cried, and led the trio running towards it. They quickly scrambled to the top and set up shop. There were easily 100 zombies below them when Ingrid began to whistle, prompting the guys to make noise as well. Slowly, some of the zombies turned and took notice of them, beginning to lumber over. Ingrid readied both of her knives, and the others got their machetes out. "Watch yourselves on this sand," she warned. "One swing that's too hard, and you'll start rolling down the hill. Those things are going to have a bitch of a time making it up here, so let's use that to our advantage." As they stood there, they looked up at the hotel where Chucky was waving at them from a window to get their attention. Ingrid curled a hand around her mouth. "Tell them not to shoot for a minute," she called. "Let us get this crowd spread out." He gave her a thumbs up and disappeared inside. The first few zombies began to climb the dune, a few of them tumbling over backwards as they struggled to manage the terrain. Finally, a few reached the top, and Meat and Rocky quickly struck them down. They pulled the corpses towards them and tossed them back to keep the battlefield clear. The next wave was a little more intense, with a dozen getting close. Ingrid kicked the leader forcefully in the chest, sending several of them tumbling right back down to the bottom. The guys started swinging, lopping off heads and cracking skulls. The falling corpses bought them a few moments to reset for the next group. As they battled, there was a horn honking in the distance, which drew more of the ghouls away from the house and towards them. Within minutes, the thick pack of a couple hundred zombies broke up into more manageable packs of several dozen. As Ingrid and the boys did battle, she paused to let out a whistle and get Chucky's attention as he appeared back in a window. "Light 'em up!" she bellowed. A few moments later, the gunfire started up again, with numerous zombies dropping to the ground. This helped pull a few ghouls away from the dunes, which was helpful for the trio, because they were starting to get overwhelmed by the number of corpses climbing up towards them. There were nearly 50 creatures, all trying to reach the top of the hill, and the trio fought with everything they had, stabbing and bashing and kicking. One ghoul lashed out and managed to grab Rocky by the arm, eliciting a shriek of panic. Meat came down hard on the zombie's arm with his blade, severing it at the elbow. Rocky jerked hard at the same time, and the momentum sent him tumbling backwards down the dune, landing hard at the bottom.
"We're going to get overrun if we don't retreat,"
Meat bellowed. Ingrid stabbed a zombie in the head, kicking it backwards before reaching over and grabbing another one. She pulled it forward, sending it down the backside of the dune. It wasn't graceful, landing hard on its face. "Do it!" she barked. "We'll hit 'em while they're down." Meat and Ingrid ran down the hill, skidding next to Rocky and helping him to his feet. They watched as the zombies came over the top of the hill, stumbling forward and slamming face first into the sand before rolling towards them. One by one they grew close enough for the group to strike, ending the threat with a simple strike to the back of the head. "You all right?" Ingrid asked as she dusted off Rocky. He nodded sheepishly.
"Yeah, ego a bit dinged up, but I'll live," he admitted.
She chuckled and then stabbed another zombie through the eye. It took another solid 15 minutes of fighting before the battlefield fell silent. The quiet was broken by the sound of a car horn blaring.
"Hey!"
Buck's voice echoed.
"You guys okay?"
The trio trudged up the dune, stepping over corpses as they went. When they reached the top, Ingrid gave an exhausted thumbs up. As they made their way down, Chucky jogged out of the hotel.
"Man, I'm glad you're okay,"
he huffed. "That was fucking crazy."
"Who the hell was shooting?"
Buck asked as he got out of his truck. Chucky jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Come on in," he said. "Got some new friends for you to meet." The 6 of them wandered into the small hotel, which looked remarkably well kept for being in the middle of the apocalypse. 4 people descended the stairs, 2 men and 2 women that looked to be in their mid-40s. They were dressed in cozy beach casual wear, carrying a small arsenal of weapons, assault rifles and shotguns, to name a few.
"Welcome to Cape Disappointment,"
one of the men said. The bikers and Ingrid slowly raised their hands, and then the man lowered his gun immediately, waving a palm back and forth. No, he said. "I genuinely mean that. Not trying to sound like a discount action movie villain over here." He grinned and put his arm around the woman next to him. "I'm Tony. This is my girl Annie." He motioned to the other couple. "Benny, and that there is Heather." After everyone let out deep breaths and exchanged introductions and pleasantries, they gathered in the lobby. "Can we offer you a drink?" Annie asked. "Something to eat, maybe?" The bikers exchanged glances before nodding.
"Yeah, we wouldn't turn down either of those," Buck agreed.
Benny and Heather headed off towards a back room while Tony motioned for the group to come sit down at a large round table near the reception desk.
"So, what brings you to our little slice of paradise?" Tony asked.
Buck looked at Ingrid, and she nodded to let him know she'd take it from there. "My name is Private Ingrid Mitchell," she began. "I'm with the U.S. military. As I'm sure you've noticed, we've invaded and captured Seattle recently."
Tony nodded. "Kinda hard to miss, with the explosions and smoke rising in the distance," he drawled. "Kept up with it on the radio, too. Riveting stuff."
Benny and Heather emerged from the back room with bottled water and packs of crackers and dried fruit.
"Normally, we'd offer to grill you something up, but we haven't been able to go fishing in a week or so," Benny said as he dumped the packages on the table. "Ever since that mini-mob wandered into the area."
"This is great, thanks," Buck said with a nod. "They just showed up one day?" Meat asked as he unscrewed the cap on his water bottle.
Annie nodded.
"We kind of knew they were coming," she explained. "We saw them from across the water a few weeks ago, slowly inching their way towards us along the road. We think they're from the people who tried to escape, but weren't so lucky." "Managed to lure them into town and keep them there," Heather continued. "At least, until you guys showed up."
Chucky wrinkled his nose and scratched the back of his head.
"Yeah, about that," he said slowly.
"Sorry we kind of ruined your evening like that. I don't usually like to do that. Well, at least not like that."
There were some light chuckles around the table.
"So how did you manage to miss the chaos?"
Ingrid asked as she opened a package of dried cranberries.
"We drove past it on the way here. Looked like things went south in a hurry."
"I bought this place a few years back," Tony explained. "Annie and I decided to start our retirement early and run it. Things were great, busy during a few months of the year, and then we had most of the peninsula to ourselves. Few other locals lived here, of course, but everybody just kept to themselves."
Annie sighed and shrugged.
"When all of this happened, we thought about running with the rest," she admitted. "Jacob, the owner of the grocery store in town, became infected early on. Once he was out of the picture, the four of us loaded up on everything we could and holed up here."
"We kind of hoped we could ride the storm out," Benny added. "Who knew this was going to be the storm that never ended?"
Meat crossed his arms.
"What about Raymond?" he asked.
"What about it?" Tony asked.
"You managed to get everything from there as well?"
Meat asked. The four of them shook their heads.
"We had enough trouble just staying safe here," Tony said. "Had a few friends up there that we talked to on the radio. Just hearing the fighting that was going on there was enough for us to stay put."
Benny sighed.
"Last we heard, everything was stripped clean anyway," he said, "so not worth the risk." "We can confirm that you were 100% right on that," Buck declared.
"Nothing to be found?" Benny asked with a wince.
"I found a couple of skin mags, but that's about it," Chucky piped up.
Heather and Annie wrinkled their noses, giving the younger man looks of distaste.
"You'll have to excuse Chucky,"
Sasha said loudly.
"He's a moron."
"Hey now!" Chucky cried.
She cocked a brow at him.
"Am I wrong?" she asked.
"Well," he stammered. "No, but it's still not nice."
The group chuckled a bit, breaking the tension, and for a short time the only noise was crinkling wrappers and chewing.
"It's okay,"
Annie finally said.
"You helped us get rid of our zombie problem. We can put up with a little flavor."
Sasha smacked Chucky on the back as the group laughed again at his expense.
"So,"
Ingrid finally said, leaning forward and clasping her hand on the table,
"I have to ask. I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't."
Tony sighed.
"You want to know how much food we have, don't you?" he asked.
"I do," she confirmed.
He glanced at the others, and they nodded encouragement.
"Assuming the fish continue to bite, we should have enough to get us to the spring," he said.
Buck pursed his lips and shook his head.
"Enough food to last 4 people for what, 3 months?" he asked. "That would last about 15 minutes in Seattle."
"We could take them with us," Ingrid suggested.
Meat shook his head.
"Or we could leave them alone and pretend we never found anything," he countered.
"What about our cut?" Rocky asked.
We've risked our lives and haven't found anything but stuff for Chucky's spank bank."
Meat stared at him with a level gaze. "Just means we have to go out again tomorrow and hope for some better luck," he said. "These people have fought hard for what they have, and I, for one, am not going to play a role in taking it away from them." "Meat's right," Buck agreed. "Hell, with what they've given us, we've already gotten most of what we would have gotten anyway. What do you think, Ingrid?" She took a deep breath.
"I'm not a fan of lying to my superiors," she said dryly, "but I think it's necessary in this case."
"We would be forever in your debt if you did that,"
Tony said quickly.
"Plus, if you ever get tired of city life, you have a nice seaside getaway you can retreat to,"
Annie added with a smile. Rocky shrugged.
"Yeah, I guess," he muttered. "Fuck it. At least they gave us some gas so we can go out on a ride."
"Do you have a pen and some paper?"
Ingrid asked. Heather nodded and headed for the front desk, returning with the requested items. Ingrid took them and jotted down some numbers.
"You said you have a radio here?" she asked.
"Not here, but there's one a few houses up," Benny corrected. "It was a massive setup, so we didn't want to risk messing it up by moving it."
Ingrid nodded.
"Good plan," she said,
and slid the notepad and pen towards them.
"This is one of the frequencies the military is using to try and reach survivors around the country. It's good to tune in as they give updates as they search. Or you want to join us in Seattle, just reach out and they'll take care of you. Think of it as a security blanket."
Tony offered her a smile.
"We really appreciate it," he said.
Ingrid checked her watch and then got to her feet.
"We're going to have to get a move on if we're going to make our pickup," she said. "Where are you being picked up?" Heather asked.
Ingrid jerked a thumb over her shoulder.
"Northern tip of the island," she said.
"It's about a 5-minute drive," Benny said as everyone got to their feet. "Road is pretty clear."
There was a round of handshakes and thanks and well-wishes, and the quartet walked the bikers outside, waving from the door as they got into their truck. Ingrid watched them disappear as they drove away. In her heart, she knew that they'd done the right thing, but the disappointment was significant. Chapter 10. The group sat on the porch of a massive beachfront home, their feet propped up on the railings, resting and admiring the view. The sun hung low in the sky, casting red and orange hues that reflected on the ocean below.
"Man, how much you figure a place like this costs?" Chucky drawled.
Sasha smirked.
"You know the old saying," she said. "If you have to ask, you can't afford it."
"Shit. The real estate agent would see him walking in the door and just immediately yell out no," Rocky joked.
Ingrid laced her fingers behind her head lazily.
"In Chucky's defense, it might not be clear they were talking about the property," she pointed out, "since that's a woman's default reaction to him coming towards them."
The group erupted in uproarious laughter, even Chucky, who pulled out his magazines and held them up in the air.
"And that's why I'm hanging on to these like they're made of gold," he declared.
Buck inclined his head towards the water.
"Looks like your people are right on time,"
he said, motioning to the cutter in the distance, and a pickup raft headed their way.
"Would expect nothing less,"
Ingrid said. The group got up and headed down the stairs towards the beach as the boat approached.
"Think we could convince them to let us move out here?" Sasha joked.
"Yeah, what do you think, Ingrid?" Buck teased. "We find enough supplies, you think we can get a retirement home?"
"If they say yes, then you'd better have an open spot for me and your gang," she shot back.
"Well, hell, girl,"
Chucky said, throwing up his hands.
"With the way you're ragging on me, it's like you're a member already."
Meat grinned.
"I think it's safe to say that you can ride with us any time, Ingrid," he assured her.
Chucky smiled and nodded at her, a clear indication that he was cool with her despite the constant ribbing. The boat pulled up and the sailor at the helm didn't say anything, just motioned for them to get on. They all piled in and Meat brought up the rear, giving the boat a mighty push before hopping in. As they moved, Ingrid furrowed her brow.
"Everything okay, sailor?" she asked.
He looked rattled and didn't answer, focusing his gaze on the cutter. Ingrid glanced at Buck with a worried look, and he returned it. The silence was tense for their ride back to the cutter, and the captain stood there waiting for them as they got back on. Once the raft was secure, he turned to the sailor.
"Get us back home,"
he instructed.
"Yes, sir,"
the sailor said, and scurried off.
"Captain, is everything okay?" Ingrid asked, motioning to the man as he left. "Your sailor there didn't seem to be having a good day."
"To be quite frank, none of us are," the captain replied.
She furrowed her brow. "What are you talking about, sir?" she asked.
"You weren't the only group to go out today," he replied, shaking his head. 10 groups just like yours were sent out to smaller towns around the area.
Ingrid's heart pounded in her ears, because she had a feeling she knew what he was going to say next. "And?" she prompted.
"The ones who managed to survive the day came back just as empty-handed as you did," the captain said shortly.
She swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you for being up front with me, Captain," she said quietly.
"There's some coffee in the cabin if you want to warm yourselves up," he said. "Go easy on it, though, because it's going to be in very short supply soon."
She clenched her jaw and nodded as he disappeared inside, and she took a moment to gather herself before returning to the others.
"What's the story?" Buck asked.
She took a deep breath, schooling her expression. "We weren't the only ones who went out today," she said. "Nobody else found anything either."
"Fuck," the biker muttered. "Wait, what does that mean?" Rocky asked.
Meat raised his chin.
"It means that we are in for a very long winter, my friend," he said solemnly.
Ingrid let that sink in for a beat before motioning for them to follow. "Come on, he said there's some coffee inside," she said, trying to keep her tone light. "Let's get warm." They slowly moved inside the cabin, heads hanging low as they thought about the treacherous coming months. The end. Up next, the need for a sustained food supply takes center stage as a group investigates the surrounding farmland and the danger contained within, in Seattle Rebuild, Part 4.